Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a theory that tries to explain why we do the things we do in terms of what I would call an order of importance. In other words, we often make choices between what we can or what we should do depending on our needs. And we often think about this hierarchy in terms of the following order, where there are 5 levels, all of them aimed at the very top: self-actualization. So let's talk about that first, and then actually at the very end, we'll come back to it. Self-actualization is a very abstract philosophical idea. Abraham Maslow was a humanistic psychologist who basically argued that humans are inherently good and we're all striving for growth. And the purpose of life, according to the humanists, Maslow specifically, is self-actualization, which is what we have here defined as inner fulfillment. I think it's like happiness or reaching, your potential, becoming the person you were meant to be, achieving your destiny, meeting your dreams, things like that. So it's hard to describe in any concrete manner because self-actualization, again, is not concrete. It's subjective. It's abstract. It is something that I think would be more in the eye of the beholder than anything. But we'll come back to that. Importantly, Maslow believed that we have what are called deficiency needs. The 4 levels in the bottom are these things that we have to satisfy first before we can ever think about our own inner fulfillment, our own true satisfaction. So we're going to work from the bottom up, starting with the physiological needs. And this is basically what we need to survive in order to live. So things like food and water. Pretty simply put, we are animals, and without food and water, we can't survive. We need it to live. But one of the important considerations among all of our motivations, I'll go back, whether they're physiological or security-based or social, etc., is that our motivations are bio-psycho-socially influenced. The bio-psychosocial model, it has to be considered anytime we think about human motivation. And that is because, just like we've talked about in the past, humans are less bound by instinct than any other animal. We are far more complex in terms of culture and language and intelligence and the ability to plan for the future and consciousness compared to any other animal. We are biological creatures like every animal, but biopsychosocial factors must be considered in order to fully grasp human motivation. So let's explore that concept with the physiological level. The first thing to consider is that we are animals, so we eat food just like every other animal. We're going to be motivated to eat food because it's an instinct. We know we need it, just like every other animal. In the 1940s, there was this really interesting study conducted by a psychologist named Ancel Keys, and it was a starvation study. What Keys was trying to find out was basically what happens to human motivation if you deprive people of food. So he got some volunteers, got them to agree to not eat for a few days, and basically, to make a long story short, these volunteers became food obsessed. Essentially, they lost interest in all other drives. Like you and I have motivations for lots of things day in and day out. Maybe you want to listen to music. Maybe you want to talk to friends, watch TV, read a book, whatever it is. The point of that study was to suggest that if you take away food, nothing else becomes important. You become food obsessed. And that really homes in on the overarching point of this hierarchy. There's an order. Without the bottom needs, none of the top ones are important because I can't live without physiological needs being met. However, there's more to it than that. We are biopsychosocially influenced. Yes, again, there's biological factors involved. Like all the other animals, there are hormones, for example, that regulate my appetite. Ghrelin, for example. When I have an empty stomach, this hormone called ghrelin is released. signals to my body and my brain that I should go, I should be motivated to find food. All of us have a metabolism, a basal metabolic rate, which is how much energy we burn at a resting state. When I'm hungry, my stomach growls. So yes, I'm an animal, and there are these biological motivations to eat food. But without belaboring the point any longer, there are psychological and sociocultural factors as well. So for psychological, we could talk all day because this is a psychology class. But I think one of the more important or interesting factors to consider is mindfulness or mindlessness. Have you ever had a bag of potato chips and watched TV, and you're just kind of mindlessly eating those chips one after the other? And it's like you're not even paying attention. And the next thing you know, you've eaten half of the bag with, zero recollection. That is an example of where, you're motivated to eat probably out of boredom or distraction. It has very little to do with actually being hungry from a physiological standpoint. So there was this famous study at Cornell University, I believe it was Cornell, where they used a bottomless soup bowl. They allowed people to eat as much soup as they wanted. Half of the participants had a regular bowl. Half of the participants had a bottomless soup bowl, where the bowl was actually rigged with a tube coming from the bottom of it, so that no matter how much soup they ate, the bowl would never finish. It would imperceptibly rise back up. And what they found was that people in the bottomless soup bowl group, they ate 73% more soup. Why? Both groups were told they could have as much as they wanted. They could have seconds and thirds. But this gets at the idea that we don't just eat for biological reasons. Psychologically, when there's food in front of us, we might be trained to eat it. And so there's conditioning involved, psychological conditioning involved. Another factor to consider is the environment, the sociocultural factors. And two things pop out at me as interesting here. The first is that different cultures demonstrate different cultural taste preferences. And so that would obviously be learned because in some cultures, for example, in India, people prefer spicier foods in way higher degrees than other areas of the world. And so why would that be? Well, one theory is that in hotter climates, such as India, by spicing your food and spicing your meat, you actually prevent bacterial growth. So out of necessity, because you live in a hot environment, you put more spice on your food so it doesn't get spoiled. And as a result, you become acclimated to that. Whereas people in colder climates don't need to spice their food, so they develop different taste preferences. So one group of people might be motivated to eat in certain types of food compared to another culture, depending on learned experiences based on your environment. Again, bio, psycho, social influences in the motivation for human behavior, including the physiological needs. All right, moving up a level. Most people in the United States have physiological needs met, but not everyone, but the majority do. And so then the idea is you can focus on the security needs. Now, just like all other animals, we need to make sure we are safe. We have to protect our body from the elements. We have to make sure that we are avoiding danger and things like that. But for humans, again, it goes beyond just animal instinct. So this could also include security of your family. It could also include employment, relationship status. Sigmund Freud, he has that famous quote that you've heard before. He says, "Anxiety is the price we pay for living in civilization." So you might have anxiety over a final exam in a college class. And the idea is that from a safety perspective, you're worried about your future. It might affect your ability to gain employment and things like that. So biopsychosocial, again, for the safety or security level. Okay, going up to the third level, the social needs. We are social beings. We need connections with other people. There's biological reasons for this. In other words, there's survival value. Research has shown that, number one, our likelihood of living a long life is increased if we have stronger connections with other people. So we probably, from an evolutionary perspective, evolved as social beings because it's beneficial. Moreover, though, there's the benefit of division of labor. If if I focus on growing crops and you focus on raising livestock, we can work together to have even more combined. But again, it's all biopsychosocial. I took this quote from a different textbook. We spend billions on clothes, cosmetics, and diet and fitness aids, all motivated by our search for love and acceptance. That gets at the psychological, the idea that there's, I think, particularly in Western cultures, a strong emphasis on body image and acceptance from other people. And so we might, engage in cosmetic surgery, for example, completely go against nature by having surgery in order to gain love from other people. Very, very diverse area, again, biopsychosocial. One final consideration, again, we could talk all day, but something that just pops out as interesting, is online dating. This is sort of a new avenue to satisfy this need to belong. And interestingly, research is showing that marital satisfaction is really high among people who are meeting online. In fact, one study found that divorce rates are lower among couples who met online compared to in more traditional means. So, the idea that people can use the internet to satisfy the need to belong, which ultimately probably has something to do with reproduction, the need to belong, to connect to others and have children, is biopsychosocial. We are less bound by instinct than any other animal. Moving up one level, you have the esteem, the final growth need, before we get to self-actualization. And the esteem needs is basically the desire for achievement, the desire to accomplish things, to master certain skills, to gain control over your environment, and attain a high standard. So esteem is basically confidence in yourself, feeling like you have respect from other people. And just like I wrote in the module, research basically suggests that there are individual differences in achievement motivation. Some people are extremely motivated to achieve, and others are much more content, maybe sitting back and laying on the couch. There's nothing wrong with either of those, I suppose, whatever makes you happy. But what leads to those differences in achievement motivation? For one, it's probably conditioning, things like operant conditioning. As a child, if you do something positive and you're rewarded with a reinforcement from your parents, that might signal to you the importance of, working hard. And that's actually the main point behind this research in 1980 by a researcher named Goleman. Just like I described in the module, Goleman followed 1,500 highly intelligent children for 40 years. What he found was that after those 40 years, some of these adults were highly successful. They had achieved a lot in life, and others had not. Importantly, the differences could not be explained by intelligence because they were all intelligent to begin with. The difference was explained by grit. Grit is basically the willingness to work hard, the willingness to, get your hands dirty and get back up when you fall down. Some of these children had it and some of them didn't. And that was one of the biggest predictors of actually achieving later in life. So grit is it's a personality characteristic. It's a psychological variable. So again, what we see here is that even the esteem needs, biopsychosocial. It's all a mix of nature and nurture. All right, so let's go back. The point so far has been that every single level, from physiological to the esteem needs, is influenced by a mix of biopsychosocial factors. The last thing to consider is self-actualization. We started the video with this. We're going to end the video with this as well. This is something, according to Maslow, that we never fully achieve because it's something we will work on for the rest of our lives. In other words, we're always trying to strive for more, to better ourselves in some way, to increase our fulfillment. And interestingly, although it's an abstract concept, although it's something that's quite difficult to study, Maslow actually studied a number of people that he believed were self-actualized. In other words, people who he believed had lived up to their full potential. And he studied these people, people like Abraham Lincoln, people like Albert Einstein. He studied these people in order to collect a bunch of characteristics of what he believed described self-actualizers. So let's go through some of these. The first is that they perceive reality efficiently and they can tolerate uncertainty. So they're okay with, not knowing everything about every little detail in life. They go with the flow, essentially. They accept themselves and others for what they are. So they're not judgmental, they're accepting. They are spontaneous in thought and action. So again, I think that goes with this idea of going with the flow, being willing to negotiate and move depending on what comes at you in life, as opposed to being dogmatic. They're problem-centered, not self-centered. So their outward manifestation of energy allows them to, really get the most out of life. Next, they have an unusual sense of humor. So they are unique individuals. They're not cookie cutter. They're able to look at life objectively. Again, that gets at this idea of being non-judgmental, not trying to put your bias into everything. 7, they're highly creative. Number 8, they're resistant to enculturation. Basically, that means that they're a nonconformist. They don't, they're not a sheep. They march to the beat of their own drum. Next, they're concerned for the welfare of humanity. Again, a lot of research in psychology shows that happier people are those that give to others. 10, they're capable of deep appreciation of basic life experiences. So they get the most out of the smallest things in life. 11, they establish deep, satisfying interpersonal relationships with a few people. In other words, when it comes to their social life, they're more interested in quality of relationships as opposed to quantity of relationships. 12, peak experiences. They're always trying to get the most out of life and always interested in more. And in other words, they're trying to grow. 13, the need for privacy. Maslow emphasized the importance of a separation of one's self and society, that we have to find time for inner reflection and harmony and meditation and things like that. And 14, democratic attitudes. In other words, they understand that their opinions are not the only opinions that matter. Other people have their own beliefs, their own desires, and we should take a democratic process in things like our society. All right, so there you have it. Going all the way back, we have, this quote is also really interesting. It is quite true that man lives by bread alone when there is no bread. But what happens to man's desires when there is plenty of bread and when his belly is chronically filled? At once, the other and higher needs emerge, and these, rather than the physiological hungers, dominate the organism. And when these in turn are satisfied, again new and still higher needs emerge, and so on. This is what we mean by saying that the basic human needs are organized into a hierarchy of relative potency. So that, I think, really nicely summarized the overall hierarchy. When you have no bread, bread is the most important thing to you. But when you have bread readily available to you, you can then focus on higher, more important, more self-actualizing needs.